Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremiah Allison, and I am a mergers and acquisitions attorney at Medtronic. I also have the luxury of serving as a co-chair for the Emerging Leaders Group here at TC DIP. Now, I have the privilege and the honor of introducing one of my other half, my other co-chair, Navita Lakhram, who will be the moderator for you this morning for the hiring presentation. Navita is an associate attorney at Fredrikson Byron, where she sits in the M&A group. Her primary focus or practice focus is private equity acquisitions and sales. Prior to her joining Fredrikson, Navita was a franchise relations, compliance, and Walmart relations manager at Nationwide Franchisor of Hair Salons. She recently just returned from a secondment with a leading national middle market private equity fund in Boston, and is now looking forward, which I don't know how she's doing this, but looking forward to the Minnesota Falls, because that means winter is upon us. And so all my Game of Thrones people, the winter is coming. So please help me in welcoming Navita Lakhram.
And I am truly excited about fall in Minnesota. Personally, it's the best season of the year here, but absolutely right, winter is right around the corner. It's my absolute pleasure and honor today to introduce our panelists for today's session. We are joined by four amazing panelists. During the planning session, Nancy Howard also helped us in the planning of this particular recruiting session. So just shout out to Nancy for all of her help. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our four panelists for today. First, we have Rebekah Bailey. Rebekah focuses primarily on complex litigation, including actions as well as class and collective action litigation, and vigorously advocates for large groups of employees and consumers throughout the country at Nichols Kaster. She is a founding member of the firm's Civil Rights and Impact Team and Consumer Class Action Group, and she has also served as a member of the firm's National Wage and Hour Team. Rebekah volunteers through the Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid's Housing Court ERP project, helping tenants remain in their homes and obtain expungements of eviction actions. Thank you, Rebekah, for being here, and welcome. Next, we have Chris Pham. Chris Pham is at Fredrikson Byron with me. Chris's clients range from startup entrepreneurs to nationally recognized athletes and businesses. He is committed to pro bono work and leads the firm's inclusion and diversity initiatives. Chris is the co-chair of Fredrikson and Byron's Sports and Entertainment Group. Chris also serves as the co-vice president of the Minnesota chapter of the Federal Bar Association and as a TC DIP board member. Chris, thank you so much for your time and for being here, and welcome. Jayna Paquin. Jayna has been a member of Target's corporate law group for nearly 15 years. Her practices focus on the pay and benefits program Target provides to its 400,000 team members. She's been involved in Target's legal pro bono program since helping establish it over a decade ago, and supports Target's DE&I efforts in several capacities. Before coming to Target, Jayna was an associate with the law firm of Dorsey and Litney. Jayna, thank you for being here, and welcome. And last and certainly not least, we've got Bryan Carter, who has been a part of the Wells Fargo legal department since 2011. His practice centers on third-party risk management, including support for a broad range of enterprise initiatives and transactions. He has participated in many hiring panels during his tenure, and Bryan has also served on the board of the Minnesota chapter of the Association of Corporate Counsel. Bryan, thank you for being here, and welcome. So without further ado, I will switch it over to the panelists. As Liz mentioned, we've got a few questions prepared for the panelists, so I'll ask the questions. Feel free to jump in, panelists, if you have any thoughts, feedback, just general comments on each question. Liz and I will be monitoring the chat today, so if there are questions that you have, feel free to drop those in the chat. If they're relevant to the current topic, we'll happily raise them then. Otherwise, we will try to get to as many of your questions during the Q&A portion of the program later this morning. So first question to our panelists this morning, how does the hiring, or first, one, if you'll tell us a little bit more about your role other than what I've introduced you as today, and then if you can talk to us about how the hiring process works at your organization, what is your role within that hiring process or committee, et cetera. Any sort of insider knowledge would be much appreciated.
I can start. So at Nichols Kaster, we have our formal hiring committee consists of 4 partners from our 4 practice groups. We have about 35 lawyers, and so that's probably going to inform why, you know, our process might look a little different than some of the other panel members who are at a little bit larger firms or organizations. Our 4 partners on the hiring committee work with HR to develop a hiring process for the year. So we strategically look and see, where do we want to go? Where do we want to look for candidates? Like what the firm's needs are, and we plan from there. When we are hiring, we like to hire in pairs or interview in pairs so that we have at least 2 perspectives on each candidate for any given interview session. And then we do like to do a 2-step process. So we do have an initial interview and a callback interview. And when we do that, we like to switch our pairs so that the other 2 of the 4 of us get to meet the candidate in the second round if they didn't meet them in the first. And that's really important because when we're collaborating at the end, determining who we would like to extend offers to, we want to make sure that everyone's giving input and that everyone's met the candidates so that we are all kind of coming to the table with same or similar information. It's important in our process that we pre-select questions at the front end and that we use those questions throughout that round so that each of the candidates have an equal opportunity to discuss similar things about themselves so that we are comparing them on an equal playing field. From there, after the second interview, we do kind of meet and collaborate. We talk. We do have a score sheet or notes that we look at while we're discussing it. But these conversations, they can sometimes last a long time. There's a lot of advocacy that goes into it. We do, you know, challenge each other's thinking, and it's really important in that way that we're very comfortable in the room and that we can all be very honest with one another. And we, you know, try to remember that maybe candidate A had a really great interview in round 1, but maybe just didn't bring the energy in round 2. And maybe that's the reason for the disconnect, so to speak, between some of the members of the committee and their impressions on a particular candidate, those sorts of things. So that's how we do it for more of our formal large scale hiring. For smaller one-off hiring opportunities, we do have a partner in a particular practice group and usually one other attorney, maybe another partner, maybe an associate who hires, especially if it's staff members. They also try to use pre-prescribed questions to make sure there's fairness for each of the candidates, but it's a much smaller scale process. I don't know, Bryan, if you want to kind of give us.
Sure, I can give you a sense of how things work at Wells Fargo. It's not dissimilar to what you've described, Rebecca. We typically have 2 different opportunities. You know, either there's a growth opportunity in one of the teams where we're expanding the size of our footprint, for example, or if someone has moved on to another role, you know, we have the opportunity to backfill that position. But much like that, we'll work with the recruiter to create the position so that gets posted. We have the opportunity then to ensure that as the recruiters are reaching out to the community, that we're being intentional about ensuring that we get a diverse pool because of the placements for that opportunity. It's not simply on our website, but we reach out to targeted organizations to make sure that we're reaching a diverse population because we want to have a diverse pool of candidates. Then that gets filtered through by the recruiters. The hiring managers have an opportunity to review that and to work with the recruiter to ensure that the folks that actually get a phone screen and then are selected for the interview process are also that we have the opportunity to try to ensure that we're actually speaking with a diverse group of population. Obviously, when you're just looking at names on a resume, you can't be completely confident about that, but we strive to ensure that based on geography and other factors that we're striving to achieve a diverse group of candidates to chat with. And then as we go further into the process, we select an interview panel. So we reach out to people on the teams. My group consists of about 6 different teams. I have the privilege of leading one of those. But so we have the opportunity to reach out to other teams. And then as we populate the interview panel, We also are trying to ensure that the panel itself represents a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds and geographies and all the rest of that. And then we'll bring, once you've passed the phone screen and we've decided on the candidates that we actually want to interview, then we'll go through the actual interview process. It's frequently these days a single round of interviews. So we'll have maybe 4 panelists on the panel. And we, much as you mentioned, Rebekah, we'll have a standard slate of questions that every candidate is asked so that we can ensure that we're being fair. We also ensure that we're very scripted in those questions so that we don't have the opportunity to sort of lead the witness, if you will, and that we really are being, we really strive to be scrupulous about ensuring the integrity of the process so that everybody gets a fair chance to present themselves. We also, there is some opportunity for us to try and say to the candidate why we think you should come to Wells Fargo and why this is a great organization that we want you to be a part of. And then usually at the end of the process, there's always a more open, give people a chance to ask questions and everything where we do have more of a dialogue that isn't quite as scripted. And then after that process, we have an aggregation where we get together as the team of interviewers on the panels, and we get a chance to express our reactions to the candidates in a little more detail. And then we're able to summarize that. And our goal is really to make really hard choices so that we have excellent candidates that have presented themselves well. And then the hiring manager has a really difficult choice to make because we've attracted the right sorts of candidates. They represent the diversity of our community. And then the hiring manager really has to frankly struggle to be precise about this is the best candidate. But it's an exciting process. It's a privilege to be part of it.
Thanks, Bryan. So at Fredrikson, we have a recruiting and hiring committee, which is primarily tasked with hiring our summer associates. So that's one committee and one function. And then there is also a lateral hiring committee in which it's a little bit different. That committee is primarily focused on shareholder level lateral hiring. And so just being proactive and, thinking about where there are opportunities, from a business perspective within the firm, and then encouraging our fellow shareholders to go out there and, meet folks and see who might be interested in making a move over to Fredrikson. So that's the lateral hiring process. Now, the recruiting and hiring committee has a more formalized process when it comes to summer associates. There are 9 committee members who are appointed by the board, and it's primarily shareholders and a good mix of folks who had been on the committee for quite some time, mixed in with some newer committee members for continuity purposes. And how our interviews work is, there's the initial OCI screening process or other interview process early on, and then once we get to OCI, typically a member of the committee is going to be paired with another member of the committee or even another associate or other attorney at the firm to conduct interviews. There's always 2 individuals. We have scorecards. And so the process is, essentially after the interviews, the 2 interviewers will get together, kind of go through the scorecard, have a discussion, an opportunity to provide thoughts and input on the summer associate candidate. And then submit a formal evaluation form. And shortly after that, after the candidate has had all of the interviews, the committee will meet as a group and discuss each of the candidates. We function very much as a consensus committee, an opportunity to think about globally what everybody thought, listen to everybody's feedback, and then sometimes it's a no-brainer and everybody's on board with, whether or not to make an offer. Other times there's a bit more discussion. So those are the 2 ways that we hire at Fredrikson. And my role is, serving as a member of both the recruiting and hiring committee as well as the lateral hiring committee. And lastly, I'll just say, outside of those 2 committees, lateral hiring also varies by department. That's driven by business needs. If we have a post open, oftentimes, prospective candidates who are applying, they'll meet with, oftentimes several individuals in the department or the practice group, and that process is a little bit different from the summer associate hiring process.
Great, Jayna from Target. And because Target doesn't hire people right out of law school, we have a process that very much resembles what Chris and Rebekah were talking about for Lateral, or what Bryan was talking about from Wells Fargo. So I'll just try to layer on a couple things that I haven't heard yet. First is we have all kind of finalist candidates meet with Target's general counsel. That's kind of an interesting feature of our program. And just because we do tend to have very long duration team members, they really want to make sure that there is that fit, and that that person who's coming in would be the kind of person that the GC would be comfortable going to it for advice, or could, develop a relationship with. I think the second point I would just make is part of my job is to go out and post our jobs on TC Dip's career page whenever we've got them. And every time I'm out there, I'm really impressed by what is available. So I would just encourage any of you who are looking, or even those who aren't, just to keep an eye on that page, because I think it attracts some really interesting offers and things that might be great for some of our emerging leaders.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Any final thoughts on this question before we move on to the next one to the panel? Great, thank you. Well, then back to the panelists here for our next question. How did you've shared a little bit about your background and what you sort of do for either the hiring committee or the hiring process in your organization. Can you tell us a little bit more how you got to that role, or how you became engaged in the sort of work that you're doing now from a hiring perspective? And what really drove you to be a part of the hiring process or committee, or anything similar to that?
Sure, and I'll start with this one. So again, at Fredrikson, the recruiting and hiring committee members are appointed by the board, and so each year, the board will send out a request to see who's interested in what committees, and essentially you have to raise your hand. There are a lot of folks that are interested, and so part of it is just sheer luck if the board thinks that you're gonna add value. So oftentimes when you convey your interest, you're writing an email and saying a few words about why you want to serve on that particular committee, and how you think you can add value. But beyond that, I think what you can start to do is by getting involved with the summer associate programs, at least at a firm like Fredrikson. And so even if you're not serving on the committee, oftentimes the work coordinators are looking for projects and opportunities to work with the summer associates, attend the social events, get to know them. And so by being active in the summer associate program, working with them, meeting them for coffee, lunches, things like that, you're kind of showing your sincere interest in wanting to be involved in that process. And so, that's one of the things that you can do early on. And then, after a while, then when the opportunity presents itself, say that you've been engaged with the summer associate program and you want to become more engaged and you want to serve on the recruiting and hiring committee, that would be the best way to go about that. For me, what drove me to want to be involved in the recruiting and hiring committee is, my passion for diversity, equity, inclusion, and wanting to do my part to really ensure that, we can create a really diverse and inclusive workforce. As you all know, because you're here participating in this TC Dip event, that, across the board, firms and corporations struggle to really increase and improve their metrics in this space. And so for me, I didn't want to just sit by. I just wanted to become more active and wanted to do all that I could to help our firm really improve in this area.
All right. So I guess I'll go next. As I said, our firm is smaller. It's about 35 lawyers. So I think it's true with most things. Our structure is a little bit more, things happen more organically. And my involvement with hiring was much the same way. So before we had this committee that I described earlier, we've had that for maybe 5 or 6 years. Before that, it was a lot of our hiring was just kind of done with who had the time and the availability at the moment to cover certain kinds of interviews. Obviously, you lack consistency when you do it that way, or just like the brain trust of information of how to compare and contrast candidates, over time or over even the course of a hiring session. But how I got involved was just volunteering when opportunities arose. Hiring is a lot of work. It takes away from your primary work. So if you're offering and volunteering, depending, of course, on your organization, it can be easy to get those opportunities because folks appreciate the volunteering. I think I covered maybe an OCI process once when someone needs coverage. That might be technically how I got involved, and over time was part of the process of structuring our committee more and more as we kept going. So I think I just kind of got stuck in it, but that's okay because I really enjoy the work. I think what drives me with the process is, the importance of making sure as an organization, we're not being passive or reactionary with our hiring, that we're not just throwing our jobs on our website and expecting folks to come to us, that, we have to be proactive if we want to create the type of firm that we want to work at. So we need to use the hiring strategically to make sure that we're shaping, our future. So.
That's great. And I could really relate to what you were saying, Rebekah, about like wanting to make your firm the kind of place you want to work at. I think that's really been my motivation. In all my lawyer stops so far, colleagues have been by far the most important piece of my overall job enjoyment. So part of hiring is making sure that there will be new colleagues and people coming up who that you can work well with, collaborate with, relate to, and learn from. So that's definitely been a driver. One thing I would say about in-house practice is overall in-house, I think, has a little more hierarchy than I've experienced at law firms. And so if you're fairly new to an in-house law department, you're not going to be at the top of anyone's mind for these hiring positions, which are actually seen as very important to the organization. So I would just recommend always being sure to just express any interest you have in getting involved. I know before I was actually interviewing candidates, I was trying to do that. And then I could find myself sometimes with a coffee or a quick Zoom session with someone that I think kind of helped me hone my skills a little bit. And then, as others have indicated, helped show that I was interested enough in this process to get involved in a more formal way when the time was right.
Yeah, I can echo much of that, Jayna, because my adventure started actually when I came to Wells some years ago. I must have interviewed with like 10 different people, both within the team that I was going to be joining and also with some clients and some other stakeholders. And it was just a grueling process. I thought, is this thing ever going to end? And I finished an interview and I came home to my wife and said, I'm not getting this job. I really would like to join these people. This isn't going to work out. So anyway, after I joined and I got to know the professionals that I have the privilege of working with, they were taking that much care because, and it's going to sound campy, but it's a family. This team is really tightly knit, and the leadership that we had was like, look, when we bring somebody in, it's a tremendously important decision. So we want to take the care and give it the time that it deserves to make sure that this candidate is really the best choice for this position. Right. And so that really was my foundation for this. And so now with this intentionality and with the company's focus on ensuring that when our customers come to our branches, they see themselves, they see the community, right? The whole corporation needs to reflect those values. So we've got over 1,300 people in the legal department, and these hiring decisions have to be dispersed. So we don't have the luxury of letting everybody interview with the general counsel for just that reason, Jayna. But I think when you express interest in being on a hiring panel, and when you say that you're committed to those same values and that you're interested in it, there are going to be lots of opportunities, whether it's on a team that you're associated with or a neighboring team where we also have connections. If you're interested in it, just express that interest. When you bring that passion and when you take the care to ensure that future members of the organization share the same commitment that we do to these things, the same commitment to their clients and to their communities, just express that interest and you'll have the opportunity, frankly. And it's been wonderful for me. And as that spreads out throughout the organization, that just continues to build.
That's great. Thank you so much. Moving on to the next question here, and I know many of the panelists, you've already spoken to this a little bit, but if you could share, once you're on the hiring panel, what are some tips that you have to be successful in that role? Are there things that we should know, or skills that we should know that would be important for an interviewer or a person on a hiring panel or recruitment committee? Any thoughts welcomed?
I can start off with that one. I think one of the most important things to consider in that role is just empathy, and just taking a moment to, we've all interviewed for jobs at various stages, and just to kind of put yourself in the position of someone who's there being interviewed and who might really, really hope that this works out, just to make sure that kind of helping them along and like working with them in the process to make sure you get the best sort of sense of who they are and their job as possible. I think the other thing I would add is just knowing that we as humans can be biased in any number of ways, constantly and all the time. And one of the examples that I'll give is, we hear a lot about hiring people that look like you and think like you. But we did a kind of a tabletop blind hiring exercise at Target a while back, where my results showed that I was being like extremely tough on candidates who had just had children. I myself had had a baby fairly recently, and that was like not really the best point in my career and in any number of ways. But it was funny. It was actually like, called out as results as like as a real bias. And did some subsequent reading about it. And sometimes we can be even the hardest on people who, resemble our situation most closely. So I would just say, try to be as sensitive as possible and as aware of all this other garbage we bring to these decisions to make sure we can suss out anything that doesn't belong there.
That's great. Thank you. Rebekah, Bryan, or Chris, any other tips or things we should know as an interviewer?
Well, I would echo that. I mean, I was thinking, we're all hard-headed and we have that critical mind that's essential to the practice. But to Jayna's point, you've got to bring with that sort of a kind-heartedness, because somebody may just be having a bad day. At the end of the day, all they have is their responses to the interview questions. But I feel that our goal is for them to have the best interview that they can have, because if they're having a bad day, we want them to have the best day they can have, because it's only when they present themselves well that we get a real deep sense of whether they're going to be successful in the position. So, where we can't lead the witness or things like that, we have to treat everybody fairly. We also want to try to put people at their ease so that they can really have the best day that they can have. And I think Jayna, that's an excellent point about being mindful of your own biases. And so sometimes that hard-headedness about being a lawyer, you've got to bring in some soft-heartedness that says, wait a minute, these are human beings. And it can be challenging to balance, but I think being aware of that, being alert to that as you're going through the hiring process is essential.
One other thing I would add is it's important to remember that it's just as much your job to get information about this candidate and to give your opinion about this candidate as it is your job to sell your organization to this candidate, especially in today's market where everyone's looking for top talent, and it really isn't a candidate market right now. So don't forget that your job is to put your best foot forward on behalf of your organization, and don't forget that part of the role.
And I think the only other thing that I would add is, I think it's important to maintain energy. Oftentimes during these interview processes, it's a long day. There's a lot of interviews, and you can sense yourself starting to drag. And I think to Bryan and Jayna's point, we want to make sure that we are providing the candidate with the best opportunity to show their best. And so by being energetic, and that's contagious, and we want them to feed off of that and reciprocate that. So I think that's whether that's a skill or just an abundance of coffee, I think it's important either way.
That's great. Thank you. And I hope the panelists will forgive me a little bit, but just based on where this discussion is going, I'm going to switch to the next question a bit and just ask then, as you're listening to the answers from the candidate that you're interviewing, how do you balance empathy for that candidate and understanding your, the needs or the desires of the fellow members of your committee, and advocating for your own opinion during that process? It seems like there's a little bit of tug and pull here. I would love to hear more.
Sure. So I think that this is, was kind of touched about a little bit from Jayna, but I would add that it's really important to frequently remind yourself as you're interviewing person after person, you don't really know these people. You know what they've given you during that 20 minutes or whatever time frame you're working with. And so we shouldn't be making assumptions about where they're coming from. We don't know what their day's like, but we also don't know what their background is, especially if we're dealing with less experienced candidates, somebody who's still in law school or right out of law school. And so it's very, you have to be very careful to make sure that you're not making assumptions, you're assigning meaning to particular moments in that interview that may be inaccurate or wrong. I guess the best example I could give of it is if you have a, appearingly younger candidate who is maybe in law school, who's acting very informal in their responses, maybe not as professional as you're normally, usually, you're used to seeing in your interviews, that can be really off-putting to us lawyers who, up until the pandemic, many of us were still wearing suits every day, right? Formality is a really big part of the job. But why is it off-putting, and why does it matter to this job? Is this a teachable thing? Is this a lack of experience, or is this really a personality trait that doesn't fit with your organization? So you have to kind of challenge your thinking on some of this stuff, challenge your programming to make sure that you're giving everybody a fair shake to find the best person for the job. So I think cross checks on why you care about this thing that happened or this perception you have. And I think it's really important that you have a hiring committee that's comfortable with one another and having those tough questions and challenging one another as you are, presenting, your take on a particular candidate or an interview, or you're, giving your opinion to try to sway one way or another. It's important that we check each other and make sure that we are looking at these candidates fairly and judging them on, the skills they need to do the job, not, what we think a lawyer should do in an interview, for example.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rebekah. Any thoughts on balancing empathy or, your advocating for your own opinion during the hiring process, understanding that there are also other opinions of others that might be involved?
Well, I'd echo Rebekah's comment about challenging the other people on the panel. And frankly, when I'm as a hiring manager and when I'm working on other panels, one of the things when we're trying to populate a panel, I look for people who have the strength of character to challenge themselves and each other. And I've seen examples where people are so kind-hearted that they like everybody and they don't provide challenge. And frankly, that's not the sort of strength that you need in a hiring situation. You've got to have that hardness of mind that's going to think critically and challenge things, challenge the other panelists, challenge their own biases, but to bring that energy and that commitment to the process. And then to Rebekah's point, is that it's only by creating that hard work and by challenging each other and challenging ourselves that we can really be being fair to the candidates. So I would echo what she said.
Yeah, and I would echo what Bryan said. For me, when I first joined our recruiting and hiring committee, my approach as, when I join any board or committee is kind of, to just be more laid back and, in an observing role to just kind of understand the dynamics of the board or the committee and how things work. And to Bryan's point, like, this isn't the place for that. All that Minnesota nice and passive aggressiveness, like, you need to utilize the voice that you have. The reason why you're on this committee is to utilize that voice. I think oftentimes, especially given that, our Minnesota culture, it's easy to fall into that group think and just, oh, they made a good point. Yeah, I kind of agree. That makes sense. And you might even in the process ditch your own comments or thoughts or inputs. But I think, to Bryan's point, challenging each other and challenging yourself to speak up. If you have a strong opinion on something, you shouldn't be reluctant to share that. If you disagree with, one of your fellow committee members, you should state that. You should say that, because we all come from different places, have different experiences, view, things differently. And so I think it's very critical and very important, as committee members, especially during this process, as Bryan noted, to be able to speak and share our points of view.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to the question before that we skipped. Many of you mentioned, sort of the things that you're looking for during the course of an interview, and that you typically have a slate of questions that you're asking. Are there specific things that you're listening for during an interview? Are there questions that you're asking? Any sort of insider knowledge would be helpful during the course of that interview itself.
I can jump in on this one. One of the things that's just become increasingly important to me over the years is early work experience and just kind of what that helps us know about a person. Target's a big retailer and can tell you that someone who has worked in a big retail operation actually knows quite a bit about our business, even if it was just, as a 16-year-old pushing carts for, a couple of years back in, even 20 years ago. So that's one thing I think I really like to delve into. I think it also can sometimes tell us a little bit about where people's interests lie. And particularly with inexperienced candidates, I think that can be fun. I'm also just going to throw in a random story here. So in law school, and this dates me, but there was a little more of a party culture vibe around law firms back when I was first interviewing. And a friend of mine was out for lunch with a firm where she had that impression, and somebody ordered an Arnie Palmer to drink, and she doesn't drink at all and is like completely just terrified about the whole thing, but thought it was an alcoholic drink. So then ordered one herself, and then proceeded to just have this like terrible lunch where people wouldn't understand why she was like drinking at noon, and she didn't understand like anything about it. So just even in tough interviews, I always kind of think back on that and think it could always be worse.
Absolutely fair. Thank you, Jayna. Bryan, Chris, or Rebekah, anything else that you're asking or listening for during the course of the interview?
Well, part of what I listen for is just that authenticity. I mean, as we've talked, we're trying to create this forum in this artificial, horrible setting of that interviews are, and just try to create an openness where people can just be themselves, put them at their ease. And then what you're listening for is like, look, just tell me about you, because at the end of the day, you're going to be working shoulder to shoulder with us for the next X years of your career, right? So just be open. And that can take a number of different shapes. To Jayna's points, what did you do, in college, or were you a foreign exchange student, or do you have some interesting experience that gives us an insight into you? We're going to try to share with you that we're not just lawyers, that we're human beings, and that this is a good place to work, to all the points Rebekah made. But any of that stuff that gives us that authenticity, and that we can create more of a deep connection so that we get a richer understanding of who you are. I think don't be afraid of that. We've got your resume. We know where you went to law school. You're obviously capable, right? But we need to get a deeper understanding of who you are and why you're the right fit for this particular opportunity.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is, one particular way that I do that is, when I look at the resume, I go right to the, personal interests, right? I want to know what movies you like, or what you're baking or cooking, or, if you're a foodie, just whatever the case may be. I think not only does that give us a glimpse into, the candidate personally, and also creates, puts them at ease, right? First question being something that's on your personal interest. I mean, that's really going to set the tone. You're going to be able to speak passionately about something, and, likely then going to be able to have a good interview as a result. So I agree with everything Bryan and Jayna said about that.
I'll add a little something different to it. Just as a litigator looking usually to hire litigators or staff supporting litigators, it's really important to me to hear something in your stories or how you're explaining your answers that tells me that you're going to take ownership over your case files. We don't have a very rigid hierarchical structure at this firm. We litigate our cases in partnerships. The partner and the associate and the whoever are working together. I might be writing a piece of the brief. You might, we work collaboratively. So I want to hire lawyers who are going to think, this is my case, this is my file, what should I be doing next in the file, which, where should we go from here? Because that's what it takes. You need to build upon that kind of drive to, we call it entrepreneurial spirit, but I don't, this is a firm. We're not looking to, this isn't Shark Tank, but that's kind of what we're looking for, because that's what it really takes to be successful in the litigation atmosphere. So some of our questions are kind of frankly designed to get at that sort of experience. Especially, a lot of them are designed looking at asking for situations you experienced in early jobs, right? We want to hear about your first job, which some people think is rather odd, but it tells me a lot about you and your work ethic when I do hear those stories.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Now, I know we spoke a little bit about having the confidence, to voice your opinions during the hiring process, but also challenge those of your colleagues. Could you tell me a little bit more about some of the potential issues one might experience when serving on a hiring committee or recruiting panel or something of that nature? And more specifically, how does an effective hiring committee work to challenge each other during that process? Hoping to get some thoughts about groupthink and how we can combat this sort of issue that we're seeing during the hiring process.
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, is, just being confident and, being willing to express your points of view and your opinions. Not always an easy thing to do, particularly, if there's a lot more senior folks, on the committee or, that you're working with. And so, one way to do that is to be thoughtful about, what you're conveying. Not providing just conclusions and say, this is what I think for whatever reasons. And then, also being willing to be open-minded and to listen to, you might disagree with some of your committee members, but hear them out, because we all have biases. I know for me particularly, I tend to really like candidates who have either background in customer service or they played a sport, or, team sport, right? Because they bring a lot of, skills that I think are important in what we do as attorneys. And so, I'm always inclined to want to look for those candidates and be their advocate and their voice. And so, others might have a different perspective. And so, just being willing to really listen and engage in that conversation, I think helps, everyone on the committee.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. Jayna, Rebekah, Bryan, any other thoughts on challenging groupthink and advocating for yourself and your opinions during the hiring process?
Well, I've always been so pleased with the process itself, and that's why I'm so happy with the way we do things at Wells, because frankly, we've never had a bad result. All of the times, and it's probably 15 or 20 times that we've gone through this process in various hiring committees, we've never made a bad hire. And so I think one of the keys is respect the process, and to Chris's points, you gotta show up like a professional, respect the process, give it what it deserves. That means you've got to challenge yourself, your own biases. You've got to speak up and challenge your peers, even if they're more senior than you. That was a great point that Chris made. But respect the process. It's worth it. It needs your engagement. So bring your full self to it, because the candidate's trying to have their best day. You've really got to give it what it deserves, and don't take it easy on yourself, because the stakes are just too high. We've got to get it right for ourselves and for the candidate.
That's great. Thank you. And, previous to this, we spoke a little bit about how early career attorneys, they can advocate for themselves for these roles, either in the hiring process, the recruiting committees. Are there any other tips that you would offer a junior attorney thinking about what the road ahead looks like in terms of taking on these roles? What sort of activities should they think about doing now? How can they advocate for themselves to get into some of the positions that you are in now?
Yeah, I think Chris gave some really great points earlier about getting involved in summer associate programs. I think that's a fantastic kind of foot in the door if you're looking to get more involved in hiring. This is a great question. Obviously, the right answer is going to really vary by organization. So if you are interested, I would recommend talking to somebody at your organization and expressing that interest, because they might give you, more specific and concrete ways to do this. But generally speaking, volunteer if an interviewer is needed, volunteer for that, even if it's for, one-off situations or lower level positions. So like just volunteer and let the right people know that you're interested and ready. Consider being more involved in your organization's marketing events at the law schools or marketing events that they have around town that will show your organization that you're interested in, putting the best face forward for your company. For attorneys, when interviews are happening, perhaps volunteer to be the one to take the candidate on an office tour, or volunteer to be the one to take the candidate to lunch, or however it's structured at your organization. But those are just a few little ways that you can show through your actions that you're interested in this work.
No, I think that's great, Rebekah. And one of the things I'd layer on is just make sure that you're really working your network and, staying connected in your legal community at all times. I think one of the best sources that exists for open positions is others within the firm who know people who might be interested. And I think if you can establish yourself as someone who is involved in ELG or other groups that are important to you, and that you have a network of folks, maybe some of whom might be interested or good fits for these jobs, put them out there and just make sure that people within your organization understand that you really kind of have, that you have that function, and that you can maybe draw in folks that they may not otherwise know about.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, in addition to keeping in touch with your colleagues, keep in touch, with your law schools, particularly if they're local law schools here where we're hiring from.
Mm-hmm.
The career services. I have a colleague that I graduated with from law school, and she's working there, and we often keep in touch, and we talk about prospective candidates and who she is seeing, and things like that. And the other item I'll note is find out who the director of recruiting and hiring is at your firm, and offer ways that you can help them or engage them and let them know that you're interested. I think that's yet another way that you can convey that interest in being a part of this process.
I think this is excellent. The only caution I'd say is if don't make this a check the box exercise. Don't do this because you think it's going to help your career, or because you think it's going to reflect well on you, or your dog's going to like you. Do this because you're passionate about it, that you really believe in it, right? And then bring that commitment to the process. Because if you're, if you just had a baby, or if you're, neck deep in your career and you're just grinding away and that's what's most important to you, then don't take on this sort of opportunity, because you're not going to give it what it deserves. And, our careers go through phases. And so if this isn't the right moment for you to be performing that activity, that's fine. But when it's right, and when you really are willing and able to support this, then dive in with both feet and give it everything it deserves.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. We're at the stage where we're about to open it up for questions from the attendees. So take a minute here to think about questions you might have, and you can either raise your hand or drop your questions in the chat. But before we get there, just one final question for all of the panelists today. Tell us a little bit of what you wish you knew before you got to this position, or anything else that we should be aware of, especially as junior attorneys thinking about taking on these roles in the future. What should we know, or what did you learn along the way that would be helpful for us to know?
I think one thing that I've learned along the way, Navita, is just to really have like a host's mentality anytime that you've got a candidate in, whether even if it's virtual. I mean, you are kind of in charge of that interaction, and it's as if you're having them over for dinner. And so kind of everything about that, down to the technology, is pretty much your responsibility. And, you've got to bring that energy, and also just help the candidate know that all they have to worry about is answering questions, and they don't have any of the other obligations about that interaction, because those rest with me.
Yeah, I would add, to ask questions before committing to the committee, how the committee functions, right? I've been involved in our committee for several years, and I just so happen to forget until it comes upon us that OCI is an extremely busy time period. August, when we're doing, I think I did 60 plus interviews in August. That's a lot of time. And then you're meeting as a committee, and those happen to be 8 a.m. meetings for like 2 hours. And so it's quite the commitment. So just knowing what you're getting yourself into, and knowing that you have the ability to kind of balance that from a time management perspective, I think would be important.
I guess I would just say that this is hard work. That's I wish I would have known is it's tough. I mean, it sounds like Bryan's company has figured it out. So I might have to take Bryan to lunch and get him to share some secrets with me. But until that day, I will just say you're going to get things wrong, and you should just be striving to do better the next time, because there are a lot of really qualified candidates and you are seeing a snapshot of their lives. And you're going to miss great people that are just going to get through the process, and just be conscious of that. You should be always striving to do better, because it's, it's human beings trying to make the best decision with very limited information. So just know that you're not going to always get it right.
And the only thing that I'd add to these excellent comments, I think Jayna just nailed it, right? You're in the position of power. Be gracious. Take that host mentality. I love her phrasing. The only thing I'd add to that is when you're in that position, try some humor. I think that that's a great way to put people at their ease. I mean, we're so stuffy. We're lawyers. Geez. I mean, but let it go. Just, if you can create that open environment where people are comfortable having dinner with you, to Jayna's point, I think that's just spot on spiritually. That's what we are trying to achieve as the committee, right? And then for the candidates, just be you, right? And you also have to recognize that if you go, your only objective can be to have a good interview, right? If you aren't the right candidate for 1,000 different reasons, don't take it too hard, right? There will be another job. It'll be okay, right? But in my experience, if you trust the process and you're just fully yourself, the right answer will usually shake out. And if you don't get that opportunity, you may actually thank yourself because you really wouldn't have been a good fit there. That can be hard to sit with, but I think if you run a good process and you behave in the ways that Jayna has encouraged us to, then usually the right outcome is going to come about. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We do have a question here from the attendees today. The question is, have you had instances where you've not had a diverse pool of candidates for a position? And in those instances, what have you done?
Yes, we have certainly had those instances. I think for me, given the fact that I also chair our Inclusion and Diversity Committee, I'm always thinking with that lens. And so that's one of the things that I bring to the Recruiting and Hiring Committee is, if we are coming down to, just 2 open spots left, all right, what does the makeup of our class look like? What's the gender balance? What's the racial diversity balance? And keeping those things in mind and, wanting to advocate for those individuals to increase that pool. That's something that I'm extremely sincere and passionate about. And, it goes back to wanting to be outspoken, right? If it comes down to just a couple of spots and there are certain committee members advocating for one candidate over another, and, if you respectfully disagree, you have to, be willing to share that and support that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We look at resumes and other paper submissions with names redacted, and we have a version of a Rooney Rule that we employ. So we have to at least interview a threshold amount of diverse candidates. And we're, like I said, we're selecting that blindly. So it's really important to make sure that we are reflecting our DEI goals, that we are proactively marketing ourselves in the right places so that we are, so that enough folks know about the opening and have the opportunity to apply. I think that's the most important point, is like what you do in the front end. If you don't have enough people once you get to the interview, you've probably done something wrong. And marketing, as was talked about earlier, is another great way. Networking is another great way to help with that as well.
You know, I'd say too that we're asked to target, like, go to your personal networks. Like, who else do we know? Who are you, you know, even somewhat connected to that might have an interest or know someone who is? And I think we're always looking for people to build on those connections that they have, and, you know, all the better if that's something that you personally work on.
And what I've seen is, you know, if you're not seeing what you want in the pool, you extend the position, you repost, right? Because this is vital. And so, you know, because of the way the recruiters work, some of them are more diligent than others. And so as a hiring manager, I have that responsibility, is because this is my team, or it's the team of a colleague, and I want them to be successful. So if we're not getting the diversity in that pool, keep trying, because we're not done until we're done. So.
That's great. Thank you. Another question here. How has your interviewing process or hiring process changed over the last 2 years, particularly in response to the pandemic?
I'm muted and then unmuted. One of the things that I've seen, the biggest change for us is just in a hot labor market, we don't have the luxury of doing 2 rounds of interviews anymore. Because in 10 days, a top candidate will have another offer. So part of what I'm grateful for is that the hiring folks, the people on the committee that we're working with, it's like, just clear your calendar. I know you're busy. This is more important than whatever you're working on, right? Because you're talking about the future of the team, the future of the organization. So just make time and accommodate the candidates' schedules. But the drag with that is, when you have 2 rounds of interviews, you can have that many more voices to evaluate the candidates. So it is unfortunate, but frankly, we're just having to move a lot faster.
I mean, obviously, the obvious answer is we're doing a lot more on Zoom. I never did really job interviews on Zoom before the pandemic, and now they're mostly that way, or if not almost exclusively now. We did have a candidate this past week request an in-person interview, which I thought was an interesting choice and stood out to me. I actually think that was a good idea for that person. But, you know, of course, if you're doing Zoom interviews, that means you can more efficiently schedule them, for one thing. And also you can, it's much easier to expand your geographic scope when you're looking for candidates. You know, we used to talk about, for example, like what out of state OCIs would we do? Maybe do like one over here, maybe one over there. And now it's just easier to open those markets up and, you know, give it a go. You don't have to fly a whole team out to another city. So those are just, I think it's actually kind of widened or broadened our candidate pool in some respects and made things easier, but do lose some of that personal touch by keeping everything on Zoom. I think it's hard to deny that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we did, you know, to Rebekah's point, everything moving to Zoom, if we have a candidate that we really like and, you know, intend to make an offer to or do make an offer to, we give them the opportunity, if they want to come into the office, to meet some other folks in person, you know, to provide that opportunity for them. You know, obviously with everything with the pandemic, I mean, empathy and being considerate of others and you know, just having that conversation, and then, you know, trying not to allow any bias to seep in during that process, right? Because, you know, you want to evaluate everybody equally and fairly. And so, you know, keeping that in mind, as there are some folks that you might be meeting for OCI in person versus, you know, OCI via Zoom.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. We did have one more question here, if the panelists will hear us out. One of the attendees, they like the idea of redacting names on the resumes and submitted materials to keep things fair. However, oftentimes that's one of the key ways to determine whether a candidate is, of course, minority or person of color or a diverse candidate. Are there other factors and mechanisms that you look at when you're evaluating blindly to determine that this person is a diverse candidate?
I don't know how many other people do that. So I guess I'll jump in and say, this is a hot topic of debate internally that we are, you know, we're constantly reevaluating, because nothing is perfect and this is not perfect either. So, so I will say that is what we're doing right now. But we do think about it all of the time. And I do, and have heard folks at our firm say things like, well, you look at different kinds of involvement. For example, like what different kinds of like student organizations folks attended in college or even in law school to see where their interests lie. That can often help inform a perspective. So there's other pieces of a resume, for example, that can be used to identify diverse candidates if that's what you're looking at the resume to identify. But that is a great point, and something we definitely think about.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rebekah. Always a challenge trying to balance it both ways, right? Offering fairness, but also making sure that you've got a diverse candidate pool. So completely understand, work in progress. We're all working on it depending on your organization. And I don't know that there's necessarily an answer yet, but all we can do, to your point earlier, is to do better, right? Awesome. Well, with that, we've rounded out the questions for today. I'd like to personally thank the panelists for their time, their thought, their input, and of course, all the time spent planning this amazing session. You've certainly given us insider knowledge into the hiring process, and I've been taking copious notes for my own selfish reasons. And I thank you for all of that insight. With that, I will pass the rest of the program today back to Liz to send us off.